Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself. A sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox, a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration. This statement is false, and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again, and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary, but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms, across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they're grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought, and sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The McGurk effect. Why seeing changes what you hear. A person watches a video of someone speaking, sees their lips move, hears sounds, and perceives speech, but something strange occurs. The auditory signal says one thing, the syllable "baha," and the visual signal shows lips making a different movement, the movement for ga, and yet what the person hears is neither ba nor ga, but da, a fusion of the two inputs, a compromise between hearing and vision. And this is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in 1976, a robust illusion showing that speech perception is multimodal, integrates auditory and visual information, and vision can alter what you hear, can change the perceived phoneme, even though the auditory input remains constant and the effect is automatic, is unconscious, occurs even when you know it is happening, and closing your eyes restores the original bar sound, showing that vision was modifying auditory perception, and the McGurk effect reveals that perception is not modality specific, but is multimodal, that different senses interact, that seeing influences hearing and hearing influences seeing, and perception is a unified process that integrates information from multiple sources. And this has implications for theories of perception, for understanding consciousness, and for recognizing that sensory modalities are not separate channels, but are interconnected systems that jointly construct perceptual experience. Imagine experiencing the effect, watching a video where someone's lips move saying "gar" while the audio plays "bar," and you hear "da," not what was said, not what the lips showed, but a fusion, and you know the audio is "bear." Can check by closing your eyes, but when your eyes are open, you hear "da." Vision overrides audition, changes what you hear, and the effect is involuntary, is not something you can turn off. Perception integrates the inputs automatically, and this integration occurs before consciousness, before you become aware of the sound, and what reaches awareness is already a fusion, already combines hearing and seeing, and you cannot access the separate inputs, cannot hear "bay" and see "gay" separately, but only experience the integrated "da." The McGurk effect demonstrates that speech perception is not purely auditory, not simply a matter of processing sound waves, but involves visual information about lip movements, facial gestures, speaker identity, and context. And the brain combines these sources, weighs them according to reliability, and produces a unified percept. And when visual and auditory information conflict, the brain compromises, produces a perception that splits the difference. And this compromise shows that perception is not just input-driven but is constructed, is the result of unconscious inference, of combining cues according to probabilities. And McGurk is an example where the inference goes wrong, produces a percept that does not match either input perfectly, but represents the brain's best guess given conflicting information. Visualize the perceptual system as Bayesian, as computing probabilities based on sensory inputs and prior expectations. And when you see lips saying "gyar" and hear "br," the brain computes that "die" is most likely given that visual and auditory cues are both somewhat unreliable and the percept should compromise between them. And this Bayesian integration explains many perceptual phenomena, explains how the brain combines cues from different senses, weights them by reliability, and produces unified, coherent experience. And the McGurk effect is a case where the integration produces an incorrect result, but reveals the normal processing that usually works well, that usually integrates senses accurately. The McGurk effect challenges theories that treat senses as separate, that analyze vision separately from audition, that assume perception is modality specific, and the effect shows that modalities interact. That perception is fundamentally multimodal, and this has led to theories of multisensory integration, to research on how the brain combines information from different senses, where in the brain this integration occurs, and what rules govern it. And the McGurk effect has become a paradigm case, a standard demonstration of multimodal perception used in countless psychology classes and research studies. The effect also has implications for understanding consciousness, because the fusion occurs before consciousness, occurs in processing that we do not have access to, and what we experience as the result of this processing is the fused percept, and we do not experience the separate auditory and visual inputs, do not have access to the processing that combined them, and consciousness receives only the output, only the unified percept, and this shows that much of perception is unconscious. is hidden from awareness, and conscious experience is constructed from unconscious processing. And the construction is so seamless that we do not notice it, do not realize that our experience is a synthesis rather than a direct recording of input. The McGurk effect appears in discussions of cognitive penetrability, because if perception is modular, if sensory systems are encapsulated, then one modality should not influence another. Vision should not alter what you hear, but the McGurk effect shows cross-modal influence, shows that perception is not strictly modular, that different sensory modules communicate and interact. And this qualifies strong modularity, suggests that while early sensory processing may be modular, later perceptual processing integrates across modalities, and perception as a whole is not modular but is interactive. And the McGurk effect is evidence for this interactivity, for perceptual systems that are not strictly separated but are interconnected. The effect also has practical implications for understanding speech perception in noisy environments, for designing hearing aids that take advantage of visual information, for developing virtual reality systems that create convincing multimodal experiences, and for understanding how perception can be manipulated, how illusions can be created through conflicting sensory cues. And the McGurk effect shows that perception is vulnerable to these manipulations, is not simply determined by physical input, but depends on how inputs are integrated. The person watches the video, hears da, knows the audio says ba, sees the lips say ga, and yet perceives da, a fusion that is none of the inputs but is the brain's compromise. And the McGurk effect persists, demonstrates multimodal integration, challenges modular theories, reveals unconscious perceptual processing, and stands as one of the most famous demonstrations in cognitive psychology. A simple effect that reveals deep truths about how perception works, how senses interact, how consciousness is constructed from unconscious processes, and the effect remains robust and automatic, a permanent feature of human speech perception, showing that seeing changes, hearing, that perception is unified, that the brain constructs experience from multiple sources, and the fusion continues. Da heard when ba was spoken, and ga was seen, and the McGurk effect endures. The omniscience paradox. Can God know what it's like to not know everything? A theologian declares that God is omniscient, all-knowing, possessing complete and perfect knowledge of everything that can be known, every fact, every truth, every possibility, past, present, and future. And this claim seems straightforward, seems like a natural attribute of a perfect being, and yet a puzzle emerges when we consider what omniscience includes, whether it encompasses not just propositional knowledge, facts that can be stated as true or false, but also experiential knowledge, the knowledge of what something feels like, what it is like to undergo certain experiences. And the paradox asks whether God knows what it is like to not know something, whether God understands the experience of ignorance, confusion, discovery, learning, and if God does know what ignorance feels like, then God must have experienced ignorance. But if God has experienced ignorance, then God was not always omniscient, and if God cannot know what ignorance feels like, then there is something God does not know. And either way, omniscience seems incomplete, seems to have gaps, and this is the omniscience paradox, a puzzle about whether complete knowledge includes knowledge of incomplete knowledge, whether knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know. Imagine God trying to understand human experience, trying to grasp what it feels like to be confused, to search for answers, to wonder whether something is true, to make mistakes, to learn, to have that moment of insight when understanding suddenly clicks into place after struggling. And these experiences seem to require not knowing, seem to be essentially experiences of ignorance or partial knowledge. And if God has never been ignorant, has always known everything, then God has never had these experiences, has never felt what it is like to learn. And so there is an aspect of human experience that God cannot fully understand, cannot know from the inside, and this suggests that Omniscience, defined as knowing everything, is actually impossible, because knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know everything. And these two forms of knowledge are incompatible, cannot both be had by the same being at the same time. The paradox connects to philosophical debates about the nature of knowledge, about whether there are different kinds of knowledge that cannot be reduced to each other. Propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and experiential knowledge, knowing what something is like. And the distinction is illustrated by cases like colour perception. A person who has never seen red but knows all the physical facts about red light, about wavelengths and retinal responses and neural processing, does not know what red looks like, does not have experiential knowledge of redness. And when they see red for the first time, they learn something new. And this suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from propositional knowledge, cannot be obtained just by knowing facts. And if this is right, then God's omniscience, if it is purely propositional, misses something, misses the experiential dimension. And God does not know what it is like to see red for the first time, does not know what it is like to learn, does not know what ignorance feels like. Visualize the problem as a conflict between two divine attributes: omniscience, which requires always having known everything, and perfect empathy or understanding, which requires knowing what human experiences feel like from the inside. And human experiences include experiences of not knowing, and so perfect understanding seems to require having been ignorant. But omniscience seems to exclude ever being ignorant, and the two attributes pull in opposite directions, and something must give. Either God is not omniscient in the full experiential sense, or God does not fully understand human experience, or the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge is mistaken, and God can know what ignorance feels like without ever being ignorant, through some superior form of knowledge that encompasses both facts and feelings. One theological response is to argue that God's knowledge is sui generis, is of a different kind than human knowledge, and God knows what ignorance is like, not by experiencing it, but by knowing its nature completely, by understanding all its causes and effects and phenomenal properties, and this understanding is so complete that it counts as knowing what ignorance is like, even though God has never been ignorant. And this response tries to bridge the gap between propositional and experiential knowledge, tries to say that sufficiently complete propositional knowledge includes experiential knowledge, but critics argue that this misses the point, that no amount of knowing facts about an experience captures what the experience is like, that there is an irreducible, subjective aspect that can only be known by having the experience, and so God's propositional knowledge, however complete, does not include experiential knowledge of ignorance. Another response is to embrace kenosis, the theological idea that God voluntarily limits divine attributes. And this view says that God can and does experience ignorance, that in becoming incarnate, in taking human form as Christ, God experienced human limitations, including not knowing things. And the gospel accounts support this, showing Jesus learning, growing in wisdom, not knowing when the end times would come. And this shows that God can experience ignorance without ceasing to be God, that omniscience is not essential to divinity, but is a power that can be set aside. And this resolves the paradox by denying that God is always omniscient, accepting that there are times when God voluntarily limits divine knowledge. But this creates new puzzles about whether a being that is not always omniscient can be called omniscient, and whether divine attributes can be temporary. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of ignorance, between merely not knowing a fact which God never experiences, and the phenomenology of searching for knowledge, the feeling of curiosity and discovery, which God might be able to simulate or understand through analogical reasoning, and God knows what it would be like to be in a state of ignorance, even though God is never actually in such a state. Just as someone who has never been to Mars might know what it would be like through detailed scientific knowledge and imagination, and this response tries to preserve both omniscience and experiential understanding by making experiential knowledge a form of imaginative or counterfactual knowledge. But again, critics argue that simulating or imagining an experience is not the same as having it, that there is a difference between knowing what it would be like and knowing what it is like, and God's simulated ignorance is not real ignorance and does not provide the experiential knowledge that the paradox concerns. The omniscience paradox also raises questions about divine immutability, the claim that God does not change, because if God learns or discovers anything, then God changes, gains knowledge that was previously lacking, and this violates immutability. And so perfect knowledge seems to require having always known everything, never learning, never being surprised, and yet this static, eternal knowledge seems incompatible with understanding temporal beings who do learn and are surprised, and reconciling omniscience and immutability with understanding human experience remains a challenge for classical theology. The paradox extends beyond ignorance to other experiential states. Does God know what it is like to be tempted, to feel desire for something forbidden, to struggle with moral choice? And if God is perfectly good, necessarily good, then God cannot be genuinely tempted, cannot feel the pull of evil, and so there is an aspect of human moral experience that God cannot know from the inside, and this creates distance between divine and human experience, suggests that God's understanding of humanity is necessarily incomplete, necessarily limited by God's perfection, and this is ironic, that God's perfection prevents complete understanding, that to fully know what it is like to be human, God would have to be imperfect, would have to experience weakness and ignorance and temptation, and these are incompatible with divine perfection. Some theologians embrace this limitation, argue that God's knowledge is perfect for a perfect being, but does not include the experiential knowledge of imperfection. And this is not a defect but a feature, a reflection of God's nature. And just as we do not think a perfect circle is defective because it is not a square, we should not think God is defective because God does not know what ignorance feels like, because such knowledge is incompatible with perfection. And the paradox assumes that all knowledge is good and more knowledge is always better. But perhaps some kinds of knowledge are only available through imperfection, and lacking them is not a limitation but a consequence of being perfect. Others reject omniscience entirely, argue that it is an incoherent concept, that complete knowledge is impossible, that there are always things that cannot be known, experiential states that require imperfection, future free choices that are not yet determined, logical truths that exceed any finite or infinite mind's capacity to grasp all at once. And if omniscience is impossible, then God is not omniscient. But this does not diminish God, does not make God less than perfect, because perfection means having all attributes that it is possible to have, not having impossible attributes. And omniscience, like omnipotence, when examined carefully, turns out to be impossible. And so God is not omniscient, but maximally knowledgeable, knows everything that can be known, and this is sufficient for divinity. God stands outside time, knowing all facts, all truths, all possibilities, and yet there is a gap, an experiential gap. God does not know what it feels like to search, to wonder, to be wrong, to learn. And whether this gap is a limitation or a feature remains contested, and the omniscience paradox persists, challenging the coherence of divine attributes, forcing clarification of what knowledge means, what kinds of knowledge exist, and whether complete knowledge is even possible. And the paradox remains unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a reminder that even the most basic divine attributes, even the claim that God knows everything, conceal complexities and contradictions that philosophy continues to explore. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions, reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory, and this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it, and God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete, and then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence, and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility, like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent. And so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do. And this is not a defect in God, but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories. And the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong. And so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense. And the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence. And the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action. And different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God. And the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts. And the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal, to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle or leaves without buying anything at all, paralyzed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes, suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts a decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, people either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all. And this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales, why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision-making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second-guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, the existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good. And this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. And more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other. And the relationship is not linear, but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline. And at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options, and research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city. And these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety. And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The paradox of fiction: why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief. And yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle, because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy. And normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief, because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception, a mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real, and various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens The film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist, and the tears are real even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free. Are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain? And the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories, forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases. and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Pereboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic, inheritance, and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Pereboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility. And this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization, and this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility, and the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design, and the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains, choosing but programmed, free-feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control, and whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The paradox of analysis, how explaining something makes it meaningless. A philosopher attempts to analyze a concept, to provide a definition that captures its meaning precisely, and suppose the concept is knowledge, and the philosopher proposes that knowledge is justified true belief. And this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what knowledge is, should illuminate the concept by breaking it down into simpler components. But here emerges a paradox articulated by C.H. Langford and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore, because if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning, must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect, would not capture what knowledge really is. But if they are synonymous, then stating the analysis provides no new information, becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying knowledge is knowledge, which is trivial, tells us nothing. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. If it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. And this is the paradox of analysis, a puzzle about whether conceptual analysis is even possible, whether we can both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that concept. Imagine presenting the analysis to someone who understands the concept of knowledge, who uses the word correctly, who can distinguish cases where knowledge is present from cases where it is absent, and you tell them that knowledge is justified true belief. And if they already knew this, if the definition merely makes explicit what was implicit in their understanding, then the analysis is correct but uninformative, tells them nothing new. But if they learn something, if the analysis reveals something they did not already know, then it seems the analysis is changing the concept rather than analysing it, is offering a new concept rather than clarifying the old one. And either way, the analysis fails to do what philosophical analysis is supposed to do, both correctly identify meaning and provide insight. The paradox challenges the entire enterprise of conceptual analysis, challenges the method that has been central to analytic philosophy for over a century. The method of taking ordinary concepts like knowledge, justice, truth, and providing precise definitions. And if the paradox cannot be resolved, then conceptual analysis is either impossible or pointless. Either it cannot be done correctly, or when done correctly, it provides no insight. And this threatens one of philosophy's main methods, forces philosophers to reconsider what they're doing when they offer analyses, what counts as success and whether analysis is discovery or stipulation. Visualize the paradox as a dilemma. On one horn, the analysans and analysandum are synonymous, have the same meaning, and the analysis is correct but trivial, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man, which is true but uninformative because anyone who understands the word bachelor already knows this. And on the other horn, the analysans and analysandum differ in meaning, and the analysis is informative but incorrect, provides new information but does not capture what the original concept meant. And either way, the analysis fails to achieve the goal of being both correct and informative. And the paradox seems to show that this goal is impossible, that correctness and informativeness are incompatible in conceptual analysis. One response distinguishes between sense and reference, between how a concept is presented and what it refers to, and argues that an analysis can have the same reference as the analysandum while differing in sense, and so the analysis is informative because it presents the concept differently, makes explicit aspects that were implicit even though it refers to the same thing, and the analysis knowledge is justified. True belief is informative because even though knowledge and justified true belief refer to the same set of cases, they present those cases differently, one as a simple concept and the other as a complex structure. And learning the structure is learning something new even though the reference remains the same. And this response draws on Frege's distinction between sense and reference, uses it to explain how analyses can be both correct and informative. Another response appeals to implicit versus explicit knowledge, argues that competent speakers have implicit understanding of concepts, understand how to use them correctly, but lack explicit understanding, cannot state the definition, and conceptual analysis makes implicit knowledge explicit, converts procedural knowledge into propositional knowledge, and this conversion is informative even though it does not add to what was implicitly known, and the analysis is correct because it captures the implicit understanding and informative because it makes that understanding explicit and available for reflection. And so the paradox dissolves because correctness and informativeness are compatible when we recognize that knowledge comes in implicit and explicit forms. A third response questions whether analyses are meant to be synonymous, argues that philosophical analyses are not claims about linguistic meaning, but claims about the nature of things, about what knowledge really is, about its essential properties, and knowledge is justified. True belief is not a claim about what the word means, but a claim about what knowledge consists in, about its metaphysical structure. And this claim can be informative, even if it is necessarily true, even if knowledge could not be otherwise, because discovering necessary truths is informative. Learning that water is H2O was informative, even though it is necessarily true that water is H2O, and so philosophical analysis is more like scientific discovery than like lexicography, more like finding out what things are than like defining words. And the paradox assumes the wrong model of analysis. The paradox also connects to debates about analyticity and the analytic-synthetic distinction, because if analyses are analytic truths, true in virtue of meaning, then they should be trivial, should be knowable a priori just by understanding the concepts. But many proposed analyses are controversial, are rejected by competent speakers, and this suggests either that analyses are not analytic, or that analyticity is more complex than traditionally thought, And Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction can be seen as embracing the paradox, as arguing that there are no purely analytic truths, that all statements are revisable, that meaning and fact are not sharply separated, and so philosophical analyses are not discoveries of meaning, but proposals for how to understand concepts, and their value is pragmatic, depends on whether they illuminate, rather than whether they are correct in some absolute sense. The paradox remains unresolved. Different philosophers offer different solutions based on different theories of meaning and different conceptions of what philosophical analysis aims to achieve. And the paradox continues to challenge the methodology of analytic philosophy, forces ongoing reflection on what analysis is, what it can accomplish, and whether the goals of correctness and informativeness can be reconciled, or whether philosophy must choose between them. And the concept of knowledge sits waiting for analysis, and the philosopher proposes justified true belief. And the question remains whether this is a discovery or a stipulation, whether it is correct or informative, or neither or both. And the paradox persists, a puzzle about philosophy's methods, about whether conceptual analysis is possible, about the relationship between understanding and articulation, between implicit grasp and explicit formulation, and whether the attempt to make our concepts precise enriches or distorts them, captures their meaning or creates new meanings. And the paradox endures as a permanent challenge to philosophical methodology, a question about whether philosophy can deliver on its promise to analyze and clarify concepts, or whether the very attempt to analyze creates a problem that cannot be solved without giving up either the goal of correctness or the goal of informativeness. And the analysis hangs there, proposed but problematic, informative or correct, but not both, and the paradox remains. The is-ought problem, why facts cannot tell us what to do. Science describes the world, tells us what is, what exists, how things work, the laws of nature, the facts about atoms and organisms and stars, and these descriptions are supported by evidence, by observation and experiment, and they are objective, true or false, regardless of what anyone thinks or wants. And ethics prescribes action, tells us what ought to be, what we should do, what goals to pursue, how to treat others, and these prescriptions are normative, involve value and obligation. And the question that has haunted philosophy since David Hume raised it in 1739 is whether we can derive ought from is, whether we can move from factual premises to moral conclusions, whether what exists tells us anything about what should exist. And Hume's answer was no. There is a gap, an unbridgeable chasm between descriptions and prescriptions, between facts and values, between is and ought, and no amount of purely factual information can tell us what we should do. And this is the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine, because it cuts moral reasoning off from empirical inquiry, separates facts from values, and leaves us wondering how moral knowledge is possible if it cannot be derived from facts about the world. Hume observed that writers on morality begin with ordinary observations, with statements about human nature or God or social arrangements, statements that use the copula is, describing what exists, and then suddenly they switch to statements using ought or ought not, prescribing actions or condemning behaviours. And this transition, Hume says, is never explained, is never justified. The writers seem to assume that the ought follows from the is, that because things are a certain way we should act in a certain way, but this assumption is invalid. The ought does not follow. There is a logical gap, and any argument that moves from is to ought is either invalid or contains a hidden normative premise that was smuggled in. And if all moral arguments ultimately rest on normative premises that cannot be derived from facts, then moral reasoning is fundamentally different from empirical reasoning, is based on values or sentiments or intuitions that are not themselves factual claims. Visualize an argument that tries to derive ought from is. Suppose someone says humans are naturally cooperative. This is a factual claim about human psychology, and then concludes, therefore, we ought to cooperate, a normative claim about how we should behave. And Hume's challenge is to explain how the conclusion follows from the premise, what licenses the move from description to prescription, and the argument seems to assume that what is natural is good, that we should act in accordance with our nature. But this assumption is itself a normative claim, a hidden ought premise, and if we make it explicit, the argument becomes humans are naturally cooperative, and we ought to act according to our nature. Therefore we ought to cooperate. And now the argument is valid, but it rests on a normative premise, the claim that we ought to act according to our nature. And this premise cannot be derived from facts about what human nature is. It is a value judgment, an ought claim, and so the original argument either was invalid or contained a hidden normative premise. And either way, the is-ought gap remains. The ought was not derived purely from is. The same problem arises for any attempt to ground morality in facts. If someone says actions that maximize happiness are good because happiness is what everyone wants, the argument moves from the facts that people desire happiness to the normative claim that happiness is good, and this move assumes that what people desire is good. Another hidden normative premise, or if someone says we should obey God's commands because God created us, the argument moves from the fact of creation to the obligation to obey, and this assumes that we ought to obey our Creator. Another normative premise, and in every case the derivation fails unless a normative premise is included, and if normative premises cannot themselves be derived from facts, then the ultimate foundation of ethics is non-factual, is based on values or intuitions or conventions that are not grounded in empirical reality. The is-ought problem creates a dilemma for moral philosophy. Either accept that moral claims are not factual, are not true or false in the way scientific claims are, but express attitudes or prescribe actions or reflect cultural conventions, and this leads to non-cognitivism or relativism, views that deny objective moral truth, or accept that moral claims are factual, but insist that moral facts are sui generis, are not reducible to natural facts, are known through intuition or reason rather than through empirical observation, and this leads to non-naturalism, the view that morality is objective but not part of the natural world, studied by science, or find some way to bridge the is-ought gap, to derive ought from is, and this requires showing that certain facts entail normative conclusions, that the gap is not as wide as Hume thought, and various philosophers have attempted this, have proposed that the gap can be crossed under certain conditions. One attempt to bridge the gap involves institutional facts, facts about social practices and their constitutive rules. John Searle argued that if you accept a role within an institution, you accept the obligations that come with it. If you are a chess player, you ought to move the bishop diagonally, not because of an additional normative premise, but because that is what it means to be playing chess. The ought is built into the description of the institution, and similarly, if you make a promise, you create an obligation. You ought to keep the promise, and this ought follows from the fact of promising, from the institution of promising and its rules, and Searle claims this shows that ought can be derived from is, that institutional facts bridge the gap. But critics respond that this only works if you already accept the institution, already grant that you ought to follow its rules, and so the normative premise is still there, hidden in the acceptance of the institution. Another attempt involves functional facts. Facts about what things are for. Philippa Foot and others argue that living things have natural functions. Hearts are for pumping blood, eyes are for seeing, and organisms can be evaluated by how well they fulfill their functions. A good heart pumps blood efficiently, a defective heart does not, and humans have functions too, and virtues are traits that enable humans to flourish, to live well, and so we ought to develop virtues, and this ought to follows from facts about human nature and human flourishing. But critics respond that this assumes flourishing is good, assumes that we ought to pursue the goals set by our nature, and these assumptions are normative, are not themselves derived from facts about what human nature is, and so the gap remains. Visualize the gap as a chasm. On one side stand all the facts, all the truths about how the world is, what exists, how things behave, and on the other side stand all the norms, all the truths about what ought to be, what we should do, what goals are worth pursuing. And Hume's claim is that no bridge connects the two sides, that you cannot start with facts alone and reach the norms, that any path from one side to the other requires a leap, requires introducing a normative premise that is not itself factual, and this chasm separates science from ethics, separates empirical inquiry from moral philosophy, and raises the question of how we can have moral knowledge if morality is not grounded in facts. The is-ought problem has implications for moral realism, for the claim that moral truths exist objectively, because if moral truths cannot be derived from natural facts, then what are they? How do we know them? And moral realists divide into naturalists who deny the gap and claim that moral facts are natural facts, and non-naturalists who accept the gap and claim that moral facts are sui generis, are known through intuition or reason, and both positions face challenges. Naturalists must explain how to bridge the gap, must show how ought follows from is, and non-naturalists must explain how we perceive non-natural moral facts, how these facts relate to natural facts, and whether morality can play any causal or explanatory role if it is separate from nature. The problem also affects applied ethics, because if we cannot derive ought from is then scientific information alone cannot tell us what to do, cannot settle moral questions. A doctor knowing all the medical facts about a patient still needs normative principles to decide whether to continue treatment or allow death. An economist knowing all the facts about wealth distribution still needs values to decide whether inequality is unjust. And science can inform these decisions, can tell us the consequences of different actions, but it cannot by itself tell us what we ought to do, what outcomes we ought to pursue. And this means ethics is ineliminable, is not reducible to any empirical science, requires normative reflection and judgment that goes beyond factual knowledge. The chasm yawns, facts on one side, values on the other, and no bridge appears and Hume's guillotine falls. Severing is from ought, description from prescription, and the is-ought problem remains, unsolved, persistent, dividing metaethics into camps, challenging moral realism, questioning whether science can answer moral questions, and forcing recognition that normativity is distinct, that ought is not reducible to is, that values are not facts, or if they are facts, they are strange facts, facts that cannot be derived from ordinary empirical observations, and the problem endures as one of the central puzzles in philosophy, a reminder that ethics is autonomous, that moral reasoning requires more than empirical knowledge, and that the relationship between what is and what ought to be remains one of the deepest and most difficult questions we face. The knowledge argument, what the colour scientist learns when she leaves her room. A scientist named Mary spends her entire life in a black and white room, a room devoid of colour, where everything is shades of grey, and Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who specialises in a colour vision, and she studies colour from this colourless room using black and white monitors and books. And she learns everything physical there is to know about colour, learns about wavelengths and photoreceptors and neural pathways, learns about opponent processing and colour constancy, knows exactly which brain states correspond to which colour experiences, can predict with perfect accuracy what someone will report when shown a coloured object. And Mary's knowledge of the physical facts about colour is complete, exhaustive, includes every fact that physics, chemistry, and neuroscience can provide. And yet Mary has never seen colour, has never experienced red or blue or yellow. And then one day, Mary leaves the room, steps outside, and sees a ripe tomato for the first time, and she experiences red. And philosopher Frank Jackson asks, does Mary learn something new? Does she gain new knowledge when she sees red for the first time? And the intuition is yes. She learns what red looks like, learns what it is like to experience red. And this new knowledge is not physical knowledge, because she already had all physical knowledge. And so there are facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts. And physicalism is false. And this is the knowledge argument, also called the Mary argument, one of the most influential arguments against physicalism, a challenge to the view that the physical facts exhaust all facts. Imagine Mary's situation, surrounded by books and papers explaining colour in physical terms. She knows that red light has wavelengths around 700 nanometers, knows that it activates long wavelength cones in the retina, knows the neural pathways from retina to visual cortex, knows which patterns of neural firing correspond to red experiences, and she can answer any questioner about the physics and neuroscience of colour, can predict how people will react to colours, what they will say, how their brains will respond. And yet when she sees red for the first time, she says, "Aha, so that is what red looks like." And this reaction suggests she learned something, gained knowledge she did not have before. And since she already knew all physical facts, the new knowledge must be non-physical, must be knowledge of phenomenal facts, of what experiences are like. And these phenomenal facts are not reducible to physical facts, are additional to them. And so physicalism is incomplete, fails to capture everything about consciousness. The knowledge argument can be formulated as follows. Mary knows all physical facts about colour vision before leaving the room. When Mary leaves the room and sees red, she learns something new. Therefore, there are facts about colour vision that are not physical facts. And this conclusion supports property dualism, supports the view that conscious experiences have phenomenal properties that are not physical properties, that the subjective character of experience is something over and above the objective physical facts. And the argument challenges physicalist theories of mind, challenges the claim that neuroscience can give complete knowledge of consciousness, suggests that first-person subjective experience involves aspects that third-person objective science cannot capture. Visualize the two kinds of knowledge. On one side is Mary's complete physical knowledge, all the objective facts about colour, the facts that can be stated in scientific language, measured by instruments, predicted by theories. And on the other side is phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what red looks like, knowledge that can only be acquired through experience, through having the experience oneself. And the knowledge argument says these two kinds of knowledge are distinct, that no amount of the first kind can yield the second kind, and this distinctness shows that phenomenal facts are not physical facts, that consciousness has properties that resist physical reduction. Physicalists have developed multiple responses to the knowledge argument. The ability hypothesis argues that what Mary gains when she leaves the room is not new factual knowledge, but new abilities. The ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red. And abilities are not facts, are know-how rather than know that. And so Mary's gain does not show that there are non-physical facts, only that physical knowledge does not automatically confer all abilities. And this response distinguishes knowing facts from having abilities, treats phenomenal knowledge as a kind of skill rather than propositional knowledge. The acquaintance hypothesis argues similarly that Mary gains acquaintance with red, becomes directly related to the experience of red in a way she was not before. But this acquaintance is not knowledge of new facts, it is a new way of knowing old facts, a new mode of presentation of facts she already knew. And so the knowledge argument fails because what Mary gains is not new knowledge, but new acquaintance. An acquaintance with experiences is compatible with physicalism, does not show that there are non-physical facts. The old fact, new guys response argues that Mary learns no new fact but learns an old fact in a new way, learns about the physical property of experiencing red by having that experience, whereas before she only knew about it through descriptions and theories. And the same fact, the physical fact about red experiences, can be grasped in different ways, through theoretical knowledge or through direct experience, and Mary's situation involves gaining a new mode of access to old facts. not gaining access to new facts, and so the argument does not refute physicalism. Another response denies the key intuition, argues that Mary does not learn anything new when she leaves the room, that she already knew what red looks like from her complete physical knowledge. That complete physical knowledge includes phenomenal knowledge, and our intuition to the contrary is mistaken, is based on underestimating what complete physical knowledge would include. And if Mary truly knew everything physical about colour, then she would be able to deduce what red looks like, would already have phenomenal knowledge. And so the argument's premise is false. The knowledge argument also raises questions about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge, between theoretical and experiential knowledge, between objective and subjective perspectives, and whether these can be integrated, whether science can accommodate first-person phenomenal facts. And Jackson himself later rejected the knowledge argument, became a physicalist, argued that the knowledge Mary gains is not knowledge of new facts but is compatible with physicalism, though other philosophers continue to defend the argument, continue to insist that Mary's gain shows the incompleteness of physical accounts of consciousness. Mary sits in her black and white room, learning about colour, mastering every physical fact, and then she steps outside, and the world bursts into colour, and she sees red for the first time, and the tomato glows in the sunlight, and her reaction is wonder, is discovery, is the sense of learning something utterly new, and whether this reaction reveals that physicalism is false, that consciousness includes non-physical properties, or whether it merely shows that knowledge comes in different forms, different modes, remains disputed, remains one of the central debates in philosophy of mind, and the knowledge argument persists, powerful and controversial, a challenge to physicalist theories, a defense of the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness, and a reminder that subjective experience, the what-it-is likeness of mental states, resists capture in purely objective physical terms, and Mary's story continues to be told, to be analysed, to be debated, and the question remains, did she learn something new, something that physical knowledge could not provide? And the answer determines whether consciousness can be fully explained by neuroscience, or whether phenomenal experience involves something more, something that transcends the physical. And the knowledge argument endures as a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, the gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, between brain and mind, between what we can know objectively and what we can only know by experience. The ladder paradox, how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed, the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep, far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door, and trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door. And only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing. And so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage. It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen, and this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction. And there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door. And at this moment, both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion, and the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass, and then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered, and the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames, and relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame-dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside, and both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame-dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame, and this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled, and physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualise the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion, the electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time, trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through, contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The infinite shadow paradox, when your shadow could cover the universe. Imagine standing in a bright room with a light source behind you, casting your shadow on the wall in front of you, and the shadow is roughly your size, perhaps slightly larger, depending on the distance between you and the light. And now imagine moving the light farther and farther away, keeping it directly behind you. And as the light moves back, your shadow grows larger, stretching taller and wider on the wall, because the light rays diverge more gradually, creating a bigger shadow. And if you continue this process, moving the light farther and farther away, your shadow continues to grow. And now the question emerges, what happens if the light source is infinitely far away? If the light comes from an infinite distance, does your shadow become infinitely large? Does it stretch across the entire wall, the entire room, the entire planet, the entire universe? And if so, what does this mean? How can your finite body cast an infinite shadow? And this is the infinite shadow paradox, a thought experiment that reveals tensions between geometry, infinity, and the behavior of light. Consider the geometry more carefully. When the light is close behind you, the light rays that graze the top of your head and the light rays that graze your feet diverge at a large angle, creating a shadow that is only slightly larger than your body. But as the light moves farther away, the angle between these rays decreases. The rays become more nearly parallel, and the shadow grows proportionally. And in the limiting case where the light is infinitely far away, the rays become perfectly parallel, and the shadow, if it still makes sense to talk about a shadow, is no longer a finite shape on a surface, but an infinite column of darkness extending forever in the direction away from the light. And your body blocks a certain solid angle of light, a cone of rays, and when the light is infinitely far away, this cone becomes a cylinder, extending infinitely. And so, in some sense, your shadow has become infinite. It covers an infinite region of space. But there is something strange about this conclusion, because in reality, when light comes from very far away, like sunlight which travels from the sun 93 million miles distant, shadows are sharp and well-defined, not infinite. And the reason is that even though the sun is very far away, it is not infinitely far. And more importantly, the sun is not a point source. It is an extended object, a sphere, and light comes from every point on the sun's surface. And these different light sources create slightly different shadows that overlap. And the overlapping softens the edges and prevents the shadow from extending infinitely. And so the paradox relies on an idealization, a perfectly point-like light source at infinite distance. And this idealization does not correspond to physical reality. And so the infinite shadow is a feature of the idealized model rather than a genuine physical phenomenon. Another way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that the concept of a shadow depends on there being a surface on which the shadow is cast, a wall or a floor or the ground. And if the light is infinitely far away and there is no surface, then there is no shadow in the usual sense. There is a region of space from which light is blocked, but without a surface to project onto. The notion of shadow loses its meaning, and so the infinite shadow is not a shadow at all, but an abstract geometric construction, a cylinder of blocked light extending through space. And whether this deserves to be called a shadow or an infinitely large shadow is a matter of definition rather than a physical fact. The paradox also connects to questions about parallel lines and perspective, because in ordinary experience, parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point on the horizon. Train tracks appear to meet in the distance, even though they remain the same distance apart. And this convergence is a feature of perspective, of how our eyes or cameras project three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional images. But in the case of light rays coming from infinity, the rays are truly parallel, not merely appearing parallel, and parallel lines by definition never meet, extend forever without intersecting. And so the shadow, defined as the region blocked by your body from these parallel rays, is a cylinder that extends infinitely. And there is no convergence, no finite boundary. And the paradox is that this seems to make your small body relevant to arbitrarily distant regions of space, seems to give your finite physical presence infinite geometric reach. Some philosophers have used the infinite shadow paradox to argue about the nature of infinity and the limits of physical realizability, suggesting that infinite quantities like infinite distance or infinite extension cannot actually occur in the physical universe, that they are useful mathematical idealizations, but not genuine features of reality. And the paradox supports this view by showing that infinite idealizations lead to strange consequences that do not match experience. And so perhaps infinity is a tool for calculation rather than a description of the actual world. And the paradox is avoided by rejecting the premise that light can come from infinite distance, or that shadows can extend infinitely. Others embrace the paradox as revealing something genuine about geometry and light, accepting that in an idealized geometric setting, with a point source at infinity and parallel rays, shadows do become infinite. And this is not a contradiction, but a feature of how geometry works, and the fact that physical light sources are extended and finite distances are never truly infinite means that the paradox does not apply to real shadows, but it remains a valid thought experiment about what would happen in an idealized limit. And such thought experiments are valuable for understanding the structure of space and the behavior of light, even if they do not correspond to observable phenomena. Visualize yourself standing on an infinite flat plane, with a point of light infinitely far behind you, and the light rays come in perfectly parallel, and your body blocks a cylinder of these rays, and the cylinder extends forward forever. And if there were a wall anywhere in front of you, no matter how far away, your shadow would appear on that wall, and the shadow would be exactly your size, exactly your shape, because the parallel rays preserve size and shape. And so, in this sense, your shadow is not infinitely large, but infinitely long. It is a finite cross-section extended through infinite space. And whether this counts as an infinite shadow or merely an infinitely extended shadow is a question of terminology. But the strangeness remains, the fact that your finite body has infinite geometric influence. The paradox also appears in discussions of cosmology and the nature of the universe, because if the universe is infinite in spatial extent and light travels in straight lines, then in principle, a light source on one side of the universe could cast shadows of objects on the other side, and the time required for light to travel such distances would be infinite. And so the shadow would never actually form, would always be in the process of propagating, and this raises questions about whether infinite distances are meaningful, whether light traveling forever without reaching a destination is different from light that does not exist, and whether geometric constructions that invoke infinity are useful descriptions or merely mathematical artifacts. The shadow stretches forward, grows as the light recedes, and in the limit becomes infinite, a column of darkness extending without end, and you stand there, finite and small, casting a shadow that reaches to infinity. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether infinite shadows are possible, whether geometry allows such things. And the answer depends on what idealizations are accepted, on whether point sources and infinite distances and perfect parallel rays are admitted. And if they are, then the shadow is infinite, and if they are not, then the paradox dissolves. And the paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how infinity changes things, how limits can produce strange results, how geometric reasoning applied to idealized cases can lead to conclusions that violate intuition. And the shadow persists, stretching toward infinity, a monument to the strangeness of geometric idealizations and the care required when reasoning about the infinite. The inverted spectrum problem. What if your red looks like my blue? Two people stand before a ripe tomato, and both say the tomato is red. Both use the word correctly. Both learned color terms in the same way, by being shown red objects and hearing the word red. And their color vision is normal. Their eyes and brains function identically. And yet the question arises, do they see the same color? Does the tomato produce the same subjective experience in both? Or could it be that what one person experiences as red, the other experiences as blue? That their color experiences are inverted, their spectrums reversed, and yet because they learned language the same way, because red things produce the same relative patterns, they both call the same things red, and have no way of discovering that their experiences differ. And this is the inverted spectrum problem, a thought experiment that has troubled philosophers since Locke, a puzzle about whether subjective experiences are private, whether they could differ between people in ways that behavioral and physical evidence cannot detect, and whether such differences would matter, whether they would mean anything if they are undetectable in principle. Imagine spectrum inversion more precisely. Person A sees red things as having the experience that person B has when seeing blue things, and person A sees blue things as having the experience person B has when seeing red, and this inversion is systematic, extends across the entire spectrum. Green is inverted with purple, orange with indigo, and so on. And both people learned color words by associating them with the experiences they actually have. So person A learned to call things red that produce the blue experience, and person B learned to call things red that produce the red experience, and their language use is identical, their behavior indistinguishable, and the inversion is undetectable from the outside, cannot be discovered through any behavioral test, through any physical measurement, through any scientific investigation, because all the objective facts are the same. Only the subjective experiences differ. The inverted spectrum problem raises questions about the privacy of qualia, about whether subjective experiences are essentially first personal, accessible only to the person having them, and if spectrum inversion is possible, then qualia are private, are not reducible to anything public or objective, because two people with inverted spectrums have different qualia despite having identical physical states and identical behaviours. And this challenges functionalism, challenges the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by their patterns of causes and effects, because inverted spectrums have the same functional roles, but different experiential qualities, and so functional role does not determine qualia, does not exhaust the nature of conscious experience. Visualize the problem as a question about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. The same physical processes, the same wavelengths of light, the same retinal responses, the same neural firings produce different experiences in inverted people, red experience versus blue experience. And this suggests that experience is not determined by physical processes alone, that there is something additional, something that could vary even when physical processes are fixed. And this something is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic experiential qualities of mental states. The what, it is likeness, and the inverted spectrum problem shows, or claims to show, that qualia are real, are distinct from physical and functional properties, are private and subjective. One response to the inverted spectrum problem denies that spectrum inversion is possible, argues that colour experiences are tied to their functional roles, to how they affect behaviour and other mental states, and systematic inversion would require inverting all these connections, would require changing not just colour experiences, but all the associations and reactions and emotions connected to colours. And once all these changes are made, the supposedly inverted person no longer has genuinely inverted experiences, but has the same experiences in a different functional network. And genuine inversion, preserving all functional roles while changing only qualia, is impossible, is incoherent, and the thought experiment fails because it describes an impossible scenario. Another response accepts that spectrum inversion is possible, but argues that it does not threaten functionalism or physicalism, because if inversion is undetectable in principle, then it is not a real difference, not a difference that matters, and science is concerned with objective differences, with differences that make a difference to behaviour or physical processes, and subjective differences that have no objective manifestation are not the kind of things science needs to explain, are not part of the natural world that science investigates. And so the inverted spectrum problem, even if it shows that qualia are private, does not show that they are non-physical, only that they are aspects of physical states that science does not need to characterize in its theories. A third response appeals to the ecological theory of perception, argues that colour experiences are not arbitrary inner states, but are shaped by the environment, by what colours signify, by their natural and biological meanings. And red looks the way it does because of its associations with blood, fire, ripe fruit, danger, and these associations are grounded in evolutionary history, in universal human experiences, and systematic inversion would disrupt these associations, would make red look restful and blue look alarming, and this would be detectable, would affect behaviour. And so genuine spectrum inversion, preserving all functional roles, including emotional and associative roles, is impossible. The inverted spectrum problem also connects to the problem of other minds, because if spectrum inversion is possible, then we cannot know what other people experience, cannot know whether their red is our red or our blue. And this creates a kind of skepticism, a recognition that subjective experience is essentially private, is not fully accessible to others, and while we can know what people say about their experiences, what behaviours they exhibit, we cannot know what they actually feel, what their experiences are like from the inside. And this privacy is both troubling and profound, suggests that each person's consciousness is a private world, knowable fully only to themselves. Some philosophers argue that the inverted spectrum problem trades on confusion about the nature of colour experience, that colours are not simple intrinsic qualities, but are defined by their relationships to other colours, to contexts, to perceptual constancies, and that inverting these relationships is not coherent, not a genuine possibility, and that the thought experiment misleads us by treating colours as if they were simple atoms of experience that could be swapped without affecting anything else, when in fact colour experience is holistic, is embedded in networks of perception and cognition, and cannot be varied independently. Others embrace the inverted spectrum problem, argue that it reveals important truths about consciousness, that qualia are real, are private, are not reducible to functional or physical properties, and that any theory of consciousness must accommodate this, must allow for the possibility that physically and functionally identical beings could differ in their subjective experiences. And this supports property dualism, supports the view that phenomenal properties are additional to physical properties, are aspects of reality that physical science cannot capture. The two people stand before the tomato, both calling it red, and the question lingers, do they see the same thing? Do their experiences match? Or does one see what the other would call blue? and there is no way to tell, no test that reveals the truth, and the privacy of experience persists. The possibility that our inner worlds differ in ways we cannot communicate, in ways language cannot capture, and the inverted spectrum problem remains, not solved, not refuted, not accepted, but persistent as a challenge to theories of mind, as a thought experiment that probes the nature of subjective experience, as a question about whether qualia are private, whether consciousness has aspects that resist objective description, and whether the inner life of another person is truly accessible or forever hidden behind the veil of their behaviour and their words, and the tomato remains red, called red by both, but whether they see the same red, whether their experiences converge or diverge behind the labels, remains uncertain, remains one of the enduring mysteries about the nature of consciousness and the privacy of subjective experience. The non-identity problem, why creating a disabled child, seems wrong but harms no one. A woman takes medication that she knows will cause her future child to be born with a disability that will significantly reduce the child's quality of life, but will not make life so bad that it is not worth living, and the child will live with chronic pain, with limited mobility, with challenges that most people do not face. But the child will still experience joy and love and meaning, and life will be worth living overall, just harder, just less good than it could have been. And we are inclined to say that the woman did something wrong, that she should have stopped taking the medication, should have waited until it cleared her system before conceiving. And if she had waited, she would have conceived a different child, a healthy child. And this seems like the obviously right choice, but now philosopher Derek Parfit poses a troubling question. Who exactly was harmed by the woman's choice? Who was made worse off? And the answer is puzzling, because the disabled child cannot claim to have been harmed. Because if the woman had waited and conceived a different child, then this particular child would not exist at all, and the disabled child's only alternative to existing with a disability is not existing. And existing with a disability, as long as life is worth living, is better than not existing. And so the disabled child is not worse off, is actually better off for existing. And if no one was harmed, then how can the action be wrong? And this is the non-identity problem, a puzzle about how to ground judgments of wrongness in cases where the identity of affected individuals depends on the choices being evaluated. Imagine the scenario more carefully. At time 1, the woman is taking medication, and she has a choice: conceive now and have a disabled child, or wait a month, stop the medication, and conceive a healthy child. And suppose she chooses to conceive now, and 9 months later, a child is born with a disability. Call this child Alex, and Alex grows up facing challenges, but also experiencing good things. And on balance, Alex is glad to be alive, prefers existing to not existing. And now we ask whether the woman wronged Alex, whether Alex was harmed by the woman's choice. And the problem is that the alternative was not Alex without the disability. The alternative was a different child entirely, because different sperm and egg would have united if the woman had waited, and different genetic material produces a different person. And so Alex's options were either exist with the disability or not exist at all. And Alex is better off existing with the disability than not existing. And so how can Alex complain? How can Alex say the woman wronged them, when the only other possibility is non-existence? And if Alex cannot complain, then who can? And if no one can complain, then in what sense was the action wrong? The problem generalizes beyond this specific case. It arises whenever a choice affects who will exist rather than merely affecting how existing people will fare. And these cases are called non-identity cases, and they include decisions about environmental policy, where current generations choose between policies that affect which future people will exist. Decisions about genetic engineering, where parents choose traits for children who would not exist without that choice. Decisions about timing of reproduction, where different times lead to different children. And in all these cases, the people affected by the choice cannot claim they would have been better off if a different choice had been made, because they would not have existed if a different choice had been made. And so, standard harm-based reasoning seems to fail, seems unable to explain why these choices might be wrong. Visualize the problem as a branching tree. At the decision point, two branches extend. On one branch, a child with disability exists. On the other branch, a different healthy child exists. And we compare the two branches and say the second is better, produces a better outcome, a healthier child, less suffering, more well-being. But when we try to say who benefits from choosing the second branch, we cannot point to anyone. The disabled child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the second branch. The healthy child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the first branch. And so there is no person who is made better off by choosing the better branch. And this seems to undermine the claim that the better outcome is better for anyone. And yet we strongly feel that the choice matters, that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong. Parfit proposed the non-identity problem as a challenge to person-affecting principles. Principles that say an action is wrong only if it makes someone worse off. And these principles work well for ordinary cases where the same people exist regardless of the choice, but they fail for non-identity cases where different choices lead to different people existing. And if we want to maintain that choices in non-identity cases can be wrong, we must adopt impersonal principles, principles that evaluate outcomes based on total or average well-being, or some other measure that does not depend on comparing how well off particular individuals are across different choices. But impersonal principles face their own difficulties. They can imply things like the repugnant conclusion. They can recommend creating vast populations with minimal welfare, and they can conflict with intuitions about person-relative reasons and obligations. One response to the non-identity problem is to reject the claim that wrongness requires harming someone, to argue that some actions are wrong, even though they do not make anyone worse off, and creating a child with an avoidable disability is wrong. Not because it harms the child, but because it fails to give the child the best start in life, violates a duty to create the best children we can, and this response requires specifying what duties we have regarding procreation, what standards of care apply to potential children, and whether these duties are owed to specific individuals or are impersonal obligations about making the world better. Another response is to argue that the disabled child is harmed after all, harmed relative to an appropriate baseline, and the baseline is not non-existence, but rather the life the child could have had if different choices had been made, even though those choices would have resulted in a different child. We can still say that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong because it brings into existence someone whose life contains avoidable suffering. And this suffering is bad even if it does not make anyone worse off compared to any alternative where that same person exists. And this response requires defending an impersonal notion of harm. Harm that is not comparative, not based on counterfactuals about specific individuals, but based on the presence of bad states like suffering. A third response is to bite the bullet and accept that the action is not wrong, that if no one is harmed, then nothing bad has happened. And this response embraces person-affecting principles and accepts their implications even in non-identity cases, admits that we cannot say the woman wronged the disabled child, cannot say she should have waited, and while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps our intuitions are wrong, perhaps we are confused about non-identity cases, and the theoretical clarity of person-affecting principles outweighs the cost of accepting counterintuitive conclusions. The non-identity problem has practical implications for reproductive ethics, for decisions about genetic screening, prenatal testing, selective abortion, and genetic modification, because many of these decisions are non-identity cases where choosing one option means one child exists, and choosing another means a different child exists. And if we cannot say these choices harm anyone, then it becomes difficult to regulate them. Difficult to say, parents have obligations about which children to create, and yet most people feel strongly that some procreative choices are wrong, that parents should not knowingly create children with serious avoidable disabilities, that we have reasons to prefer healthy children, and these feelings need grounding, need principles that explain why these choices matter, even though no particular person is made worse off. The woman stands at the choice point, medication in hand, and she can conceive now or wait, can create a child with disability or create a different healthy child, and the choice seems obvious. And yet when we try to justify the obvious answer, try to explain why waiting is better, the justification becomes elusive, slips through our fingers, because no one is harmed by conceiving now. The child who exists is glad to exist, and the child who would exist if she waited does not exist to be disappointed. And the non-identity problem reveals a gap in our moral thinking, a case where our judgments are clear, but our reasons are unclear, where standard moral frameworks fail to explain intuitions we hold strongly, and Parfit's problem remains unsolved, challenging, forcing recognition that identity matters, that who exists matters, and that moral philosophy has not yet developed adequate tools for handling cases where choices determine who exists rather than merely how well existing people fare, and the problem persists, technical and troubling, a reminder that even procreation, the most basic of human activities, raises profound ethical puzzles that resist easy answers.